Established diplomatic relations have existed since 1949, when Australia recognized Indonesia's independence. Historically, contact between Australians and Indonesians began as early as the 16th century prior to the arrival of the Europeans, through moccasin interactions with indigenous Australians on Australia's western and northern coasts. The relationship has been characterized by growing mutual trade of $17.8 billion Australian dollars in 2018-19, an increase of 6.9% over the previous year. In addition to close links in government, education, and defense under the Lombok Treaty. Both nations are members of the G20, ASEAN Regional Forum, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, among other organizations. Relations between the two countries are generally well, though there have been some strained periods since 1949, most notably the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation. In February 2020, both countries celebrated 70 years of diplomatic relations during Indonesian President Joko Widodo's visit to the Australian Parliament in Canberra. While some evidence suggests that sporadic contact between the peoples of the Indonesian archipelago and indigenous Australians occurred as early as 16th or 17th century, it was only with the commencement of the trepang trade in the 1750s that significant relations were first developed. The trepanggers departed from eastern Indonesian ports, predominantly Makassar and Kupang, and on arrival in Australia constructed shelters along with outdoor factories to process the trepang for trade with China. While they did not establish permanent settlements in Australia, there was some intermarriage with indigenous Australians and their descendants remain in northern communities to the present day. At the height of the trade, the trepanggers visited thousands of kilometers of Australian coastline, arriving with the monsoon season each December. Their boats carried up to 30 crew members, and it is estimated that as many as 1,000 trepanggers arrived each year. The crews established temporary settlements at various points along the coast to boil and dry the trepang before returning home to sell their cargo. Marege, meaning wild country, was their name for Arnhem Land, from the Kobok Peninsula to Groot Eiland in the Gulf of Carpentaria, while the northwest coast was referred to as Kayu Jawa. Using Deng Rangka, the last moccasin trepanger to visit Australia, lived well into the 20th century, and first made the voyage to northern Australia as a young man. He recalled generally positive but occasionally conflicting relationships with indigenous Australians, and was the first trepanger to pay the South Australian government trepanging license in 1883, an impost that made the trade less viable. The trade continued to dwindle toward the end of the 19th century due to the imposition of customs duties and license fees. This decline was probably compounded by overfishing. Using Deng Rangka commanded the last Perahu, which left Arnhem Land in 1907. There is significant evidence of contact with the trepanggers in the rock art and bark painting of northern Australia, with the Perahu featuring prominently in many locations. Studies by anthropologists have also found traditions that indicate the trepanggers negotiated for the right to fish certain waters. The exchange involved the trade of cloth, tobacco, metal axes and knives, rice and gin. The Yolgnu of Arnhem Land also traded turtle shell, pearls and cypress pine, and some were employed as trepangers. A moccasin pigeon became a lingua franca along the north coast, not just between moccasin and Aboriginal people, but also between different Aboriginal groups, who were brought into greater contact with one another by the seafaring Makassar culture. Words from the Makassarese language and Balind. It is speculated that the moccasins may have also been the first to introduce Islam to Australia. From the 1870s, Indonesians were recruited to work in the pearling and sugarcane industries in northern Australia. Around 1,000 Indonesians were living in Australia by federation in 1901. Almost all in Queensland and Western Australia. With the introduction of the White Australia policy at this time, most sugar workers returned to Indonesia, although some pearl divers remained. During World War II, many Indonesian nationalists were based in Melbourne. Following the surrender of Japan, Australian forces participated in the occupation of eastern Indonesia in coordination with the British Southeast Asia Command's occupation of Java. As allies during the war, the Australian and British governments claimed they were both under obligations to help the Netherlands restore their occupation over the former Dutch East Indies. Australian forces participated in the Borneo campaign alongside US forces against the Japanese, including the Battle of Balikpapan in 1945. On 17 August 1945, Indonesian nationalist leaders Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta proclaimed the independence of the Republic of Indon.